Greetings, everyone. My name is Camille Turner. I'm an artist, and I'm going to be focusing my talk on my most recent projects. I have been bringing to light 19 ships that were constructed in 18th century Newfoundland for the transatlantic trade in Africans. And I've created an Afronautic methodology to unearth this story, and I'm going to be sharing my journey with you. So on this journey, I'm confronting places where the residue of this past still lingers. I draw on the idea of the Black Atlantic, which is a fundamental concept that refers to modern cultures that emerged through the violent upheaval of 12 million souls forced from their African homelands and scattered across the ocean. Paul Gilroy tells us that the ship is a moving target space of terror that connects points across the Black Atlantic. 19 ships that were constructed in Newfoundland carried 5,798 people from West Africa to the Caribbean. 740 of them died en route. For me, this story is personal because my ancestors were carried on ships like these, and perhaps on these very ships. So thinking about Newfoundland through the Black Atlantic enables an understanding that what appears to be an innocent place was produced through transnational violence. So my journey that resulted in telling the story began years before I learned about these ships. In 2014, I visited Senegal, and I went there to think about the future and to explore the roots of Afrofuturism, which I draw on in my work. While I was in Senegal, I visited Saint Louis, which is a beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Site about 5 hours north of Dakar. In Wolof, which is one of the local languages, this place is known as Ndar. Walking amongst the colonial buildings of Ndar, I felt like I was walking through a dream. I went on an architectural walking tour, and we stopped at the very first building. The guide told us that this house was a trading post, the first in the area. Many others followed. It was owned by a young French couple who traded gum arabic, palm oil, and trafficked captured Africans as slaves. The guide took us to a dark, musty cellar, and he told us that we were standing in the place where enslaved people had been imprisoned. I was overwhelmed by the unspeakable horror of what transpired in this place. There is no way for me to know if my ancestors had been here in this cell, but their memory called out to me. I fell back in time, and I became a vessel for the story that emerged as I opened myself up to the spectral residue of this violence. On that trip to Senegal, I visited the Door of No Return on Gorée Island off the coast of Dakar. This is the most western point of West Africa. This is the fabled place where the vanquished were loaded onto the cargo holds of slave ships. I contemplated the inconsolable rupture that marks this place that Dion Brand refers to as real, imaginary, and imagined. As I gazed across the Atlantic, I felt as if someone was staring back at me from the other side of the ocean. A year later, I was invited to Newfoundland to participate in an exhibition entitled Newfoundland Lands. It was curated by Pamela Edmonds and Bushra Junaid. The show explored historical entanglements of the Caribbean and Newfoundland. And Bushra, who is a Newfoundlander of Nigerian and Caribbean heritage, had been researching this topic for years. She generously shared her research with me. We visited Cape Spear, the most eastern point of North America, and I was drawn to a door at the foot of an abandoned military battery overlooking the ocean. I peered through the door and I realized that the person I'd glimpsed through the door of no return on the other side of the Atlantic was me. I've come to think of this mission as the haunting of ancestors who've been waiting for me to tell their story, a story in which I'm implicated and one through which I came into being. One of the archival documents that Bushra shared with me is this letter. It was written in 1790 by John Fowler. He was a slave trading agent who lived in Jamaica. And the letter was addressed to Bristol merchant James Rogers, owner of the Sarah, a slave ship constructed in Newfoundland in 1788. I was stunned. I couldn't imagine a slave ship constructed in Newfoundland. The existence of this vessel opened my eyes to the ways that, as Gilroy explains, the history of transatlantic trade of Black flesh saturates the modern world. 3 years later, I was invited back to Newfoundland to participate in the 2019 Buena Vista Biennial. I decided to focus my attention on the Sarah. My partner, who is a historian, encouraged me to look at slavevoyages.org, which is the slave voyages database, to see if there were any more such ships. To my surprise, I found 42 ships used for slaving that have been built along the eastern seaboard of what is now Canada. And 19 of those ships were constructed in Newfoundland. I presented my research in an ongoing performance project called the Afronautic Research Lab. And this project takes form as a futuristic archival reading room in which the audience encounters silence and suppressed documents. The seeds of this, the Afronautic Research Lab, were sown when I taught a course at University of Toronto called Art and Community. My students and I explored alternative research methods such as walking, listening, and storytelling. And each year, inspired by Charmaine Nelson's work with her students, I took my students into the archive. I showed them how to use the microfiche readers, and I gave them names and dates of 18th century Canadian newspapers. Their assignment was to find evidence of slavery in colonial Canada. As they searched through the newspapers, they encountered people advertised for sale amongst the goods and services. They saw ads criminalizing those who escaped. And these sessions were so potent. They sparked critical debates and discussions, such as what does it mean that these ads are present in the archive, and yet they're absent from most history books and museums? And what role do archivists, historians, and heritage professionals play in silencing this information? And how does silence shape Black life? So the Afronautic Research Lab brings this experience to the public beyond the walls of the Academy. And this project has taken many forms. It's traveled across the country. What you're looking at here is an image from Afronautic Research Lab in 2017 at the Agnes Etherington Gallery at Queen's University. It was part of an exhibition there created in collaboration with Dr. Philip Howard of McGill University. It was called Arts Against Post-Racialism. In this iteration of the lab, the archivists are Afronauts, African space travelers. And the Afronauts first appeared in my work in The Final Frontier, which is a film project created collaboratively with Sobaz Benjamin, who's a filmmaker who now lives in Halifax, my sister Karen Turner, and my brother Lee Turner. We were inspired by the stories of the Dogon people of West Africa. Their knowledge of stars predate Western science by thousands of years. And their most sacred star, Sirius B, can't be seen with the naked eye. And Western scientists could not verify its existence until the Hubble telescope was invented. And yet it was part of Dogon stories for millennia. In our performance, we are descendants of Dogon space travelers who left Earth 10,000 years ago. We return home to heal the planet. We do that by reconnecting the past to the present. Once the past is reconnected to the present and reckoned with, then the future must change. The Afronauts invite visitors into the dark space of the archival reading room. We give them flashlights and magnifying glasses so they experience what it feels like to try to shine a light on suppressed and silenced histories. Since 2016, this project has traveled to many sites across the country, gathering and sharing knowledge wherever it goes. It's organized by the performance group Outer Region, which consists of myself and my siblings, Karen and Lee. Last summer, we created a workshop for the University of Toronto, for the Toronto and the Toronto Biennial called Following the Afronautic Trail. We led participants on a journey exploring what is hidden beneath our feet and experiencing what is silenced in the archive. So back to the 2019 biennial, Buena Vista Biennial. I arrived 10 days before the biennial began to create the film and performance that would become a part of the Afronautic Research Lab Newfoundland Edition. So I wanted to evoke the ghostly presence of what was silenced. And I'm going to share a little bit of that journey to making this piece through an excerpt from a diary I kept as I was when I was in Newfoundland. August 4, 2019. I'm at Ryan's premises in Buena Vista, a small town on the eastern shore of Newfoundland. Since the 19th century, these wooden buildings housed one of the largest cod export operations on the island. As the cod industry declined, this business came to an end. These buildings are now a museum offering a curated glimpse of Newfoundland's past. A photograph behind a display in the museum catches my eye. It dates to the 19th century and shows a waterfront behind the building where I was standing, covered by elevated wooden platforms historically used for drying fish. These wooden structures are called flakes. The flakes snake around the shoreline. Where one flake ends, another begins. Tina Kempt tells us that images communicate in multisensory ways, and what is outside the frame is just as important as what is inside. This image brims with silence. It reaches out to me. It commands me to pay attention to what and who is missing. I notice it depicts a wooden world built on a shore where there are no trees. A question rises within me. Where did the trees come from to build this wooden world? I found out that forests had once hugged this shoreline, but after just 2 generations of colonization, all the trees 3 miles from the water had been cut down to build flakes, boats, barrels, homes, stages. The Beothuk, one of the island's indigenous nations, had retreated into the interior forests to avoid the often deadly encounters with European colonizers. But the invaders also burst into the forest, harvesting trees to feed their growing fishing industry. With the violent encroachment on their land, there was no safe place for the Beothuk to retreat to. By the time the photograph in this display was taken, the Beothuk nation was declared extinct. After the trees were devoured, the land became scarred and barren. Auk, fox, otter, and mink disappeared. Yet Newfoundland is mythologized as a natural, unaltered, innocent white space. A deep and haunting silence obscures the genocide and ecocide that has taken place here. I follow this silence, listening for the whispers of ghosts and paying attention to my feeling of being haunted. Vivian Salehana argues that ghosts remain because justice has not been achieved. As I became aware of this silent story, a character began to emerge. I wrapped my head in white fabric. I wore fisherman's gloves with fingers cut off. I put silver boot liners on my feet. The effect was otherworldly, futuristic, ghostly. The character arrived from the future, from a time when she refers to as the Age of Awakening. She travels back to our time space, which she refers to as the Age of Silence. I filmed the character walking beside the ocean on the shores of Bonavista, carrying a rock as evidence of a forgotten people who had been imprisoned in the holds of the ships constructed there. In the 18th century, ships were displacement vessels built to carry a load. In the absence of the load, the ships had to be loaded down and balanced with what is called ballast. This often includes rocks and soil from the local area where the ships were built. When the ships sailed to West Africa, ballast rocks from Newfoundland were dumped onto the shore so that people, their intended cargo, could be loaded into the holds. As my character walks along the water, she carries a ballast rock from a slave ship built in Newfoundland that she'd found in West Africa. She also carries a staff made from wood and debris, memories of the dead and disappeared, washed up onto Bonavista's barren shores. She enters a building constructed from large wooden trees. These trees would have been the same size as the ones that were used to build the ships. Trees of this size once lined the shores of Newfoundland, but can no longer be found on the island. She reverently lays the rock and her staff on the floor as the material evidence of this history. On a table, she spreads out archival documents, providing evidence of the ships and the world from which they emerged. She exits the room, leaving the documents, the rod, the rock, and the staff as remnants of the performance. I later added cards with simple graphics, each representing one of the 19 ships, with the name of the ship and the date it was built. The ships have long dissolved into the sea. The forests from which they were made are gone. In the absence of actual material traces of this history, the rock that I fabulated becomes a witness. At the Bonavista Biennial, the film was projected onto the wall, and the audience was invited to sit at the table and examine the documents. Pencils and sticky notes were provided to encourage participants to contribute their comments and annotate the documents. They could also read the notes written by previous participants. This artwork struck a chord and sparked public discussions and debates. It attracted media attention all over the province and beyond. What was most striking about this project for me, however, was the silence of many of Newfoundland's historians and heritage professionals. The Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe Trio insists that silencing the past is an active process. If silence was not constantly produced and maintained, it would disappear. Producing silence allows the false and nostalgic mythologies of Canada to remain in place. When the past is obscured and disconnected from the present, we can't understand, much more dismantle the oppressive systems of anti-Blackness that persist. Through this work, I subverted the work of the guardians of history, forcing the archive to tell a different story and to make new futures imaginable. So here are some of the messages that were written by visitors on the archival materials. The one on the left says, "My heart is broken. This is part of our past completely unknown to me. My great-grandfather owned sawmills and his before him, all loggers. They're the trees they harvest build these ships." The one on the right, however, was written by a visitor who expressed disbelief that the ships were actually built in Newfoundland or were specifically constructed for the purpose of slaving. "I think it's presumptuous to say that slave ships have been built in Newfoundland. Were they purpose-built as such? I think not. They might more accurately be described as trade ships that carry different types of cargo. Saltfish from Newfoundland, rum and molasses from the Caribbean, humans from Africa. I would be surprised to learn that ships were built by Newfoundlanders per se. No doubt they were financed by Bristol." Afronautic Research Lab Newfoundland was followed by a film I created called Nave and another called Sarah. I'm in the process of creating two new pieces, Fly and Maria, both named after slave ships that were built in Newfoundland. To make these artworks, I utilize what I've named an Afronautic methodology. This methodology is based on four principles. Blackness is central, time is nonlinear, imagination is a tool for world making, and silence offers information and direction. The methods I use include critical fabulation, walking, and listening. Saidiya Hartman originated the term critical fabulation to describe her process of imagining what may have happened beyond what can be known through the archival records alone. Walking for me is a means of embodied research, and I use it to unmap a white settler landscape that the story takes place on. Stephanie Springay and Sarah Truman argue that walking and attending to the past, hiding in the present, unsettles linear concepts of settler colonial time. Using these methods and attuning myself to listening for what and who was silence, I encountered ghost towns, indigenous dispossession, genocide, and barren shores that once were covered by great stands of pine. These Afronautic principles gave rise to a research creation process that I've divided into 5 nonlinear overlapping stages: discovery, immersion, incubation, epiphany, and assembly. So during the discovery stage, I walked on the rocky shores of both Senegal and Newfoundland, listening to the stories told by the waves and becoming aware of and attuning myself to the residue of the past. Immersion was the most difficult and painful step in the process. During immersion, I descended into the archive. I read the trading records kept by captains of ships who chronicled the sordid details of the trade in black flesh, and I followed their journeys as they crossed the ocean. Here, I'm face to face with the violence through which my ancestors were counted as merchandise. In the archive, there are no names recorded for the people in the hold, just numbers. Total embarked, total disembarked. The dead occupy the space between these two numbers. At this stage, I stop often to grieve. Since time is non-linear, space is shared not only with those who have passed, but those yet to come. So to survive my immersion into the violence of the archive, I envision a liberated future, and I anchor myself to that future. During the incubation stage, glimmers of artworks begin to emerge, and they wake me from my dreams to write or draw them. I welcome each idea, and I try not to edit. Epiphanies are moments of sudden clarity, like the clue in the museum that informed and transformed the work. Epiphanies can happen at any time during the process. An assembly is the stage where the artworks take form. While assembling the artwork called Nave, for instance, I had an epiphany. Dion Brand explained that when she visited the door of no return, she suddenly realized that that she was a miracle. It was a miracle that she was alive. Her poem, Verso 55 and the Blue Clerk, presents her journey as a pilgrimage to the door to honor her ancestors. And she said this while I was in the process of making Nave. And I suddenly realized that I was staging a similar journey, but instead of to the door of no return, into the hold of a ship. Some of Newfoundland's early churches were built by shipwrights who were amongst the first builders of the towns. Looking up into the naves of these churches, it's like looking down into the hold of a ship. So I decided to flip the meaning of nave to use it to represent the hold of a ship. So the time traveler that I created in Afronautic Research Lab finds her way into Nave. She arrives from the future to perform a ceremony to honor those who endured the Middle Passage. And an ancestor figure that was performed by Emily Jabouin emerges from the water, offering a song of victory. She sings in Haitian Creole, reminding the diaspora of what our ancestors overcame. Drawing inspiration from Brand, in Nave, the whole becomes a transcendent place, a place in which memory can be processed and reimagined. Through Nave and other artworks, I'm unmapping Canada's white settler space and revealing the presence of the past, gesturing towards the futures that they make imaginable. So I'm going to share now an excerpt from Nave, and I dedicate this work to ancestors known and unknown. This is a collective dreaming. I call on what the oceans remember. I call on the waves to divulge their secrets. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.